Today I'd like to talk to you about forage production with limited precipitation or irrigation, options available to us here in the High Plains region. Before we get into the heart of the presentation, I want to give credit where credit's due, and Dr. Jerry Valesky, Dr. David Balzenberger, Dr. Bradley Lindenmeyer, Dr. Neil Hansen, and Joe Brummer have all contributed to the slides that you see here with the research they've done, and they should get credit for that. As we think about what forages are available to us, we've got a lot of different options as we think about things to utilize for the summer that's upcoming. Obviously things like cool season annual forages, many of those would have been already planted this spring. Warm season annual forages that will get kicked off here in late May to early June. Things like legumes, some of the perennial cool and warm season grasses that might be permanent or perennial stands that we have established that we're utilizing for grazing. And then also some of the cool season broadleafs and warm season broadleaf plants are also available to us as options. We want to think about where do forages fit in our production system in terms of what are our goals, what class of livestock are we going to be grazing or feeding, really thinking about the quality of feed we need available to us, how much management are we going to be providing, and then when is the feed or the grazing needed. We also want to think about where these forages fit in our overall production system in terms of water availability. How much water do we have available to us and when is it available? The soil type and soil fertility we have. Thinking here again that the crop we utilize with the limited water we have is going to be most water use efficient if we have the adequate soil fertility available to that plant needed to fully express the potential it has with the water we provide. We also want to think about the equipment we have available to us in terms of planting and harvesting these forages, and then also what's going to be the subsequent land use for this forage or for this piece of ground after we harvest the forage from it. So think about water use efficiency and forage crop yields. This is some data from Dr. Bowder at Montana State University looking at acre inches of water and then tons of forage produced. You can see the warm season annual forages based on his research tend to be the most water use efficient in terms of pounds of forage produced per inch of water applied. As we move down the list, we move out of the warm season into the cool season annuals and cool season perennials. And you can see things like oats, around 5 inches of water needed to produce a ton of forage. And then of course the queen of forages, alfalfa, is the least water use efficient. But I don't think that necessarily eliminates that as an option for us. We just need to think about how we utilize that crop and when we apply the water to capture the most value from that alfalfa crop when it's growing the most water use efficiency in terms of pounds of forage produced per inch of water applied. Let's talk a little bit more about alfalfa. Alfalfa as a limited water use crop does have some advantages. The first is that it's drought tolerant. It can stand some pretty long periods of drought, and we have some long-term dry land alfalfa in production here in the High Plains region, and so it's a crop that can stand these years when we have some droughty conditions. It is a long-term perennial forage, and so that is an advantage to us as well. We're not needing to reseed it every year. We do have a high-quality forage that can be produced from this that can be complementary to some of the other forages we might grow. It does provide us the opportunity to get multiple harvests, especially under an irrigation type situation. And of course, from a nitrogen standpoint, it's going to fix its own, and so the soil fertility expenses that we might have with growing some other annual forages may not be as great with alfalfa. At Colorado State University, they did some alfalfa research at the Berthoud location there, looking at different water use efficiency based on some different timings of irrigation. First thing they looked at was full season long irrigation. Second was stopping irrigation after the second cutting. Third was irrigating through the first cutting only. And then finally irrigating in the spring and fall, trying to identify which of these type scenarios was maybe most water use efficient in terms of pounds of forage produced per inch of water applied. This is a summary of that data for 2 years, 2006 and 2007, looking at either full irrigation, stopping irrigation after the second cutting, spring and fall irrigation, or stopping irrigation after the first cutting. You can see from their data that the most water use efficiency or one of the most water use efficient, was stopping irrigation after the second cutting. In their data, it yielded 91% of full irrigation over the entire season. And so as you think about application that we might be looking at under a limited water type situation, we might irrigate for a first cutting and a second cutting and then shut irrigation off. The advantage of that is we can utilize that water when that plant is most water use efficient in terms of transpiration rates that are happening in the spring are going to be less than we might have in the summer with warmer temperatures and warm, dry conditions, lower humidity. And so that's an advantage there of maybe looking at that type of scenario versus either a spring and fall or just stopping after the first. Again, stopping after the first might be the only option we really have available to us if we have a real limited water situation. But the irrigating the first and then through up to the second cutting really looked quite attractive and competitive with some of the other options in this data from Colorado State. So think about the cool season perennial grasses. Of course, they're going to be most water use efficient here in late April into and through May. And so thinking about utilizing water when they're going to grow the most forage, and then they're going to regrow or have some fall growth potentially if we get cool temperatures, will be another time to apply some water to bring that plant into dormancy with a good healthy root system in place to get it launched then the following spring. This is some data from North Platte at the West Central Research and Extension Center there, looking at 8 different cool season grass species and evaluating their water use efficiency based on when water or rain came and also pounds of forage produced. You can see the spring from that green up till late May was the most water use efficient in terms of pounds of forage produced per inch of water applied. As we moved into early summer, water use efficiency really began to drop off. In the heat of the summer, water use efficiency took a major nosedive, almost a third of what it was in the early spring. And then late summer and early fall, when cool season temperatures came back online, water use efficiency started to improve a little bit and be pretty comparable what it was to that early summer time period. As we think about the cool season annual forages, we have things like oats, spring triticale, Italian ryegrass, barley, field peas, other option available to us as well. But these are going to be most water use efficient again in that early spring time period, especially as they start to move into that elongation stage and move towards their reproductive state. This shows water use efficiency of oats. Again, thinking about an early April type planting, going to be most water use efficient there in the late May through mid-June time period. Oats also are another crop that we could think about, as well as spring triticale or barley. We could plant in the mid to late July through mid-August, depending on type of area you're in. If you're in the western part of the state, you're going to want to plant a little earlier. As you move east, you can plant a little later. But these annual forages, spring annual forages planted in mid to late summer, can provide some growth, especially in the early to mid-fall, and really get quite a bit of production from those. And we'll show some data here in a moment that supports that. As we think about annual forages and how they change in terms of pounds of forage produced, as we think about them moving from that early vegetative state into long stem elongation and then on into the boot stage, we see increase in forage yield really starts to go up dramatically. As we think about the quality, however, quality is going to go down simultaneously as forage yield is going up. And somewhere within this window here, this box, is really where we probably have our optimum between forage quality and forage quantity. And so as we think about, as we harvest that crop, as we think about ways to utilize it efficiently, capturing forage when it's in that optimum window between quality and quantity has some real advantages to us. This slide shows dry matter yield versus maturity for 2 species of cool season annual forages, barley and oats. You can see what the yield they measured is that is in the early head stage, and then as it moves into the milk stage of maturity, soft dough and hard dough. For barley, once we move into that milk stage of maturity, we don't see forage yield increase very much. However, for oats, as we move from that milk to soft dough stage, we do see a pretty significant increase in maturity, and so somewhere around the milk to soft dough stage for these two annual forages really could be the optimum in terms of that balance between forage quality and forage quantity. This just shows those two same forages in terms of what happens from a crude protein standpoint as they move into the head stage, and then from there into the milk stage and soft dough, and then finally where hard dough, or where it's starting to move to a ripened grain. We can see protein really starts to significantly drop off as we move from that head to the milk stage, and then that rate of maturity starts to continue to impact protein as we think about the forage quality. As we think about the warm season annual forages available to us, we do have a lot of options. We have things like the millet, both the grazing and haying types, sorghum Sudan hybrids, straight sorghum, Sudan grass, and then some things that we probably wouldn't usually think about utilizing, like crabgrass or corn, can also be annual forages we might utilize. Some of the warm season grasses we frequently see here used in central and western Nebraska are things like foxtail millet. Can probably be the least expensive in terms of seed. It has limited yield benefit under full irrigation, though, compared to what we could get from a Sudan grass or sorghum Sudan hybrid or something like pearl millet. Pearl millet really is a good choice for us if we're thinking about grazing, and it will produce some regrowth. That's a nice option as well. Pearl millet doesn't have some of the prussic acid issues that we can get into with some of the sorghum Sudan type hybrids. Sorghum Sudan works well if we're thinking about a silage crop other than corn. It's going to produce more dry matter per yield, or dry matter yield, than foxtail will if we have adequate irrigation water. It is going to be probably a little more expensive to plant. And then, of course, corn can be an annual forage we can use as well, and we don't often think about that as a forage for grazing, but it can be an option. Here's a picture of some BMR sorghum Sudan hybrids and what's happening with those from a grazing standpoint. You can see the cattle here are going around leaving the stem but kind of nipping off the leaves. Here's comparing the two plants, a BMR sorghum Sudan hybrid and a three-way cross of a sorghum Sudan hybrid. Again, the BMR trait being distinguished there on the left-hand side. This is some data from North Platte, Nebraska, looking at annual forage yield. Would have been 2003 and 2004, looking at how these different compare to one another. Sorghum Sudan hybrid in this data set was more productive than foxtail millet. And then also some data out at the Sidney location. Again, sorghum Sudan hybrid tended to be more productive than the foxtail millet. In 2004 there had some hail on this research, and so that impacted the amount of forage that was produced. Thinking about sorghum Sudan hybrids in terms of when would they be most water use efficient, going to be most water use efficient in the heat of the summer with long days there in that July time period. Foxtail millet, again planted in early June, going to be most water use efficient in that late June to early July period. As we think about annual forages, we can plant some annual forages in mid to late summer as well and get some high quality forage from those. We also can be thinking about some late summer seeded annual forages that might produce a little bit of growth in the fall, things like rye, triticale, and winter wheat, but are going to get most of their growth the following spring. This is some data from North Platte taken in 2012. Again, this would have been under irrigation, planting some spring annual forages in mid to late summer. This would have been planted in early to mid-August, in this case August 13th. If we were working further west out in the panhandle, we'd think about planting these from that July 20th probably to August 10th time frame. But this is really interesting data. We produced a lot of high quality forage from this research, looking at August planting and then looking at the pounds of forage yield there as it was harvested in mid to late October. Of course, we do have some of the fall seeded cool seasons that can provide some high quality pasture, things like rye, triticale, and winter wheat. Again, something we're going to get some growth from in the fall, but are going to get more of their growth than the following spring, at least for some of these winter varieties. Here's when these winter small grains are most water use efficient. Again, you can see they're going to come on in the mid to late April time period and grow most quickly in that time period in that early to mid to late May. We do have some double cropping annual forage of options available to us. As we think about maybe growing some of these, we can plant some oats in late March, early April, harvest those, and then come back with a summer annual forage. Things like rye we would have planted the following fall, but then are going to take those off in that mid-April to late May time period and could come back with something like a sorghum Sudan or Sudan grass hybrid. And then we also have an option of something like oats. Maybe we planted oats again late March, early April, graze those out or harvest them, and then come back in that early to mid-July time period. And especially in western Nebraska, think about planting another spring crop like oats or triticale that can grow a lot of forage then as we move into the fall. The annual forage that's going to work best for you is going to depend upon the resources that you have available to you, the needs of what you have in terms of livestock needs, and then the level of management. What you're willing to do from a grazing standpoint will also impact what forage is going to work best for you. I think something we might think about with annual forages also is a forage chain. These are some things we could do from a limited irrigation standpoint. Maybe we're going to use something like a cereal rye or winter triticale, then could move into a spring triticale from a forage maturity standpoint. Oats would come on from a maturity standpoint in that mid to late June into early July. Of course, then we can move into the summer annuals, and then some of the late summer seeded spring forages like oats or triticales or the brassicas could provide some fall and winter feed for us as well. And so thinking about which of these forages best meet our needs and what time frame we have forage demand could give us some ideas on when we want to utilize these annual forages. One thing I think we do want to consider is thinking about ways to capture the most forage we can, and direct and windrow grazing are really the two options available to us. I think combining these two may provide the greatest length of time to utilize some of these annual forages. Windrow grazing, what we do then is we capture that forage in its optimum window between forage quality and quantity, preserving it at that time. And so that can be an option that we can use to capture more pounds of forage per acre versus just direct grazing. There's a lot of different NebGuides available to us from a resource standpoint, looking at limited irrigation and forage production with limited irrigation, crop water use in western Nebraska, summer annual forages for beef cattle in western Nebraska, and windrow grazing are all NebGuides that can help us think about what might be the best fit for us with forages. I also recently recorded a YouTube called Windrow Grazing in Nebraska that talks about how you might utilize that not only for fall and winter grazing, but also as a way to capture forage efficiently in the spring and summer. And so I would encourage you to go check that out if you're thinking about ways to capture the most pounds of forage produced per acre with utilizing annual forages in the spring and summer. With that, if you have any questions around water use efficiency and annual forages and how we might make the best use of those, please feel free to contact me either by email or phone.